Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing. Welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. Joe, we've got an aquatics episode, and I think you're going to do a deep dive this time on something we've talked about a little bit before.
Yeah, we're going to dive deep into aeration. And so, I've been taking a class out to look at a lake or a pond nearby that we've been managing, and it has a really pretty fountain on it. And almost every single time we go out there, the students ask me to remind them why you can't have pretty fountains. And you can, but we're going to talk a little bit about why maybe that's not the best solution for a pond.
Okay, so a pretty fountain's one type of aeration system maybe, but not always the best type.
Yeah, it has its place, and it definitely has a function, but it's not necessarily the kind that we want. And so aeration is just adding air to a pond, and so we can do that in lots of different ways. Most of the time it's air. People tend to think of it as oxygen, but most of the time we're just pumping regular old air that we're breathing down into the pond, and we get some oxygen benefits from that. Very seldom would we actually take oxygen itself and pump that into a system. So it's almost always the natural air that we have around us, and we get some benefits of oxygen from that system.
So why do you need aeration?
Well, there's a lot of different reasons. One of the big reasons is that ponds tend to stratify. So we've talked before a few times about how different temperatures of water don't mix. And so they're like oil and vinegar. And I always say that it baffles me, even after 20 years of studying this, that the same compound, water, won't mix with itself.
Sure.
If it's at different temperatures, different densities. And so when that happens, you can get pond stratification, and you get a deep hypolimnion layer that doesn't have a lot of oxygen, and a top epilimnion layer that does have a little oxygen. When you get that separation, it allows limited area for critters like fish or turtles to operate and live. Obviously, they can't breathe if there's no oxygen around, and so they get constrained to a smaller portion of the pond. And when that happens, you can have the risk of something like a fish kill occurring rise up. And so one of the big reasons that you need it is because of those two different layers forming and the benefits of oxygen at the top. It allows critters to live there. Also does a lot with bacteria and other organisms. So there are a lot of benefits to having aeration. The biggest reason we want it is to make sure that thermocline doesn't substantiate, form itself. We keep the pond water all mixed up.
Cool. So you don't want a lot of anaerobic area in the pond if you can avoid it, huh?
That's right. Big word there.
Yeah.
So anaerobic, no oxygen, and so you want to avoid that if you can. You want to keep an aerobic or oxygenated environment as much as we can.
So benefits.
Yeah, the big benefits are like I said, there's oxygen everywhere, and so the critters can utilize the full amount of the pond. One of the big benefits comes from bacteria, and that's not always super exciting to talk about, but it's really important. And so bacteria that thrive in areas that have oxygen tend to decay matter quicker. They tend to be more active in utilizing nutrients, and so we can get a lot of benefits from having those types of bacteria being active, allowing that biotic activity in the benthos, or that bottom layer. So when you do that, things like leaves or dead plants or dead animals tend to break down faster, and those nutrients are used up, so you're not getting a thick, smelly layer at the bottom of the pond. One of the things that happens commonly is the bottom of your pond, if it stratifies, you're not breaking down that material, and so it just kind of sits there and starts to be really smelly. It can not smell super great. It can cause issues with, just kind of walking in it, really slimy on your feet. Lots of methane, so you might see lots of bubbles coming up in your pond. But so bacteria or the aeration is going to allow those bacteria to thrive. Kind of a secondary benefit of the aeration.
So in addition to just breaking things down or being detritivores down there in that anaerobic layer, what else are the bacteria doing?
Yeah, one of the big things, and I glanced over this, I think, is that they're using up a lot of the nutrients. And so phosphates especially like to settle down in the benthos of a pond. And one of the things that really loves phosphates are macrophytes, big plants. And so when you have a lot of phosphorus, you can get a lot of plant growth in your pond. Depending on the type of phosphorus, you might get a lot of algal growth, but you can get a lot of excessive growth that can exacerbate some of those oxygen, limitations that we talked about a little bit earlier. And so making sure that those bacteria, or allowing those bacteria to use up those nutrients instead of the plants, can really help reduce the amount of vegetation that we have in our pond. So just another benefit there of having them around.
What about water quality?
Yeah, water quality, I think a big one there is the smell that we talked about. So anaerobic bacteria that don't use oxygen, tend to fix sulfur more often than aerobic bacteria. And so you can kind of get that rotten egg smell around your pond. You might get that fairly often. And they can help clear up the water. And so some of the bacteria that are being active are going to have some of those secondary benefits. Another thing that is just beneficial is, with most aeration systems, we're moving the water around. And so that process of moving that water can kind of help keep some sediment moving around and help to filter out some of the water and keep the water quality just better overall health for the animals that are in the pond.
So what about just like healthier fish? What do we see there? Is there any benefit from a fish standpoint?
Yeah, a big thing is, that the fish aren't going to be super stressed out. And so, just like, if you were to go run a long distance or go up to higher elevation, we just went on a trip to New Mexico and went on what would normally be a pretty easy hike for me, and I was huffing and puffing before we got to the top. And so that was a similar situation. There's reduced oxygen levels up at that higher elevation, harder for me to breathe. And so the same thing happens with the fish. If they don't have as much oxygen, if the pond isn't mixed up, they're kind of being constrained into smaller areas, that can over time stress them out. And so one hike or one little time in the pond with lower oxygen isn't really going to be that big of a deal. But if you're constantly struggling to get enough oxygen, that can put stress on your body and make you more prone to different types of diseases and parasites and fish kills and things like that. You might also spend less time actively foraging, or you might not be able to get to the areas you really like to forage. So some animals like to be down on the bottom of a lake or a pond, and that's where they prefer to hang out. They feel comfortable. It's where they can eat. And so there might be some limitations surrounding that as well, where, it's not really directly that the aeration is helping, but because we're mixing up the water, we're creating an environment where oxygen levels are kind of more standardized, you can get some of those benefits to the fish where they're less stressed out, they're healthier, and they're happier. They're going to grow better, and just overall, it's better for the fish.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. With a lot of different species, the more usable space we have and the more accessible habitat is, the better off they are, the more offspring they have, the better they grow, and all that kind of stuff. So
yeah
that makes sense. So we talked about fountains.
Yeah.
What are the different kinds of aeration systems?
Yeah, when we think about aeration, fountains are what come to mind first for a lot of folks. Fountains take water from the top part of the water column, they throw it in the air, and it's really pretty. Now, one of the problems is that they're taking water from the epilimnion, from the top of the pond, and that's the area that already has oxygen most of the time. And so it's taking oxygenated water, it's throwing it in the air. You might get a little more oxygen in that level, but you're not really doing anything for that deeper layer, where a lot of that, the unoxygenated water is established. And so you're not adding oxygen to that deeper layer, and you're also not mixing up the pond as much. And so there are times where a surface fountain works great. One example would be a really shallow pond. So anything less than 4 feet deep, almost always you recommend a surface fountain, because the benthic fountains are going to be so isolated in the amount of area they can move. And so you're going to want to have something on the surface kind of covering a bigger area on the surface, those drops hitting the top of the pond. is going to add in some oxygen into that shallower region. Other common examples, wedding venues or golf courses, there's an aesthetic value of having those fountains. And so it's not just the oxygen. Having something pretty to look at a lot of times is important, especially if your pond's primary purpose is to look pretty, is for aesthetic value. And so surface aerations, they're beneficial. And most of the ponds that I go and meet people about, most of the ponds I'm looking at are 1 to 2 acres in size and somewhere around 8, 10, 12 feet deep. And so when you're talking about something that size, a surface fountain, although it's going to look pretty, isn't really going to help that oxygen level or with the stratification. And so what I generally recommend if you want to have some of this aeration would be a benthic diffusion system. And so a benthic diffusion system has a compressor, 1 to 2 horsepower compressor generally, that sits on the bank of the pond, and it has some lines leading out into the pond to diffusers, which are like the little stones that maybe you have in an aquarium, or you've seen in an aquarium where air is being pumped in and then you get a ton of little bubbles that come out of those stones. And so the same thing is happening. You put these diffusers at the bottom of the pond and push water to it through that compressor. The oxygen or the air that's being pumped there bubbles up, and it directly adds a little bit of oxygen, but mostly what it's doing is keeping everything mixed up so that we don't get that stratification in the pond, and we can keep the pond happy and healthy.
Cool. So, like if we're thinking about a aquarium setup, the water coming out of the filter, it's kind of a fountain into the pond, or a waterfall into the pond or into the aquarium. Might be more like the fountain type system, but the bubbler's more important for actually providing oxygen.
Yeah, I think that's a great visual cue there, because that water coming out of the filter it's falling in, and you can see it's mixing up that water a little bit, but it's not going all the way to the bottom normally of that aquarium and getting everything mixed up. So some benefits, just knowing your system and making sure that you're using the right type of aeration for your intended results, I think is really important.
Good. So how much aeration do we need?
That depends on the size of your pond, and it also depends on the shape of your pond. And so, if you have little fingers that are extending out, I'll see that a lot of times where you'll have shallower areas that maybe there's a little cove or something. You'll want to make sure you have aeration systems or diffusers in each of those. But the recommendation is going to be somewhere around 3 or 4 diffusers per acre that you have for your pond. And so it can get big relatively quickly. You can also think of it in how quickly it's going to cycle through and turn over the water in your pond. And so you want to make sure that ideally you're moving all of the water at least once per day, kind of keeping it moving around. And so it's going to depend kind of on what we're hoping to do, but somewhere in that 1 to 2 horsepower compressor range and the 3 to 4 diffusers for a 1 acre pond is generally going to be what you want.
What if we were trying to get the same thing done with a fountain?
Yeah, that is going to be hard to do, and it's because we're not going to be able to get to that deeper water. They do make fountains that have extenders where they're taking the water from the bottom of the pond and they're pulling that up and throwing it in the air. But the benefit of that benthic diffusion really is that we're moving a big plume of water around with those bubbles, and so more benefit comes from the movement of the bubble through the water as opposed to the bubble directly adding air to the system, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Yep, definitely makes sense. So how do we know if we need to aerate? What are the signs of low oxygen in our pond?
There will be acute symptoms, and so things like fish gasping at the surface, you need to do something quickly if you see that. And, that might be a circumstance where getting any oxygen in that water that you can is important. So, I've seen people take a mower out to the surface of their pond and just, get some agitation on the surface, trying to get enough oxygen so that the fish can survive. If you see fish that are going up to the surface and actively gulping air, that is a sign that you're really, really low on oxygen. So in that circumstance, there are some fish that have to breathe air, and so we've talked about gar before on the podcast, and so there are some fish that do that. Fish every now and then going up to the surface and gulping at something. They might be eating, they might be trying to get a breath of air, just like we take a deep breath every now and then. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a bad thing, but if you're seeing it from a lot of fish and over a prolonged period, that'd be something that you'd want to, that's a pretty bad sign that you need to do something. More long-term things, if your pond starts to have a bad smell, that sulfur type smell, that's an indication that you're getting some stratification. If you're walking in your pond and you're sinking down in a sludge layer or muck layer, that's an indication that the bacteria that are down there aren't able to work all the time to keep things broken down. And so those are some of the symptoms. I've mentioned before walking out into a pond and feeling your feet hit a spring where it gets cold. Most of the time, that's the thermocline that we're breaking through, and we're actually getting to that hypolimnion, that colder water. It's not really a spring most of the time, right?
Sure.
We're just getting to that bottom layer. And so if you start to feel that, that's an indicator that there's some stratification going on. All of those together are signs of low oxygen and maybe an indication that you'd want to add aeration. Another reason that you might want to do it is to control vegetation. So if you're getting too much vegetation, you might want to consider adding aeration to use up some of those nutrients and help you with that fight as well.
And so that's providing oxygen to the bacteria down there that are breaking down those nutrients and making them not available to the plants.
Yep, yeah. They're gonna utilize those nutrients instead of the plants. So growing bacteria instead of growing plants.
Got it. Well, that's good. How do I know if I need aeration or not?
Well, I think you figure out if you want it, first of all. If you start to have things, the people that I see that need it are, HOAs sometimes, homeowners associations that have a lot of runoff. And so, people are fertilizing their lawns, they're getting a lot of nutrients, and they need to make sure that the bacteria are super happy and they can gobble up those nutrients so they're not just overtaken with filamentous algae. If you have a fish kill or 2 fish kills or 3 fish kills, then you really need to think about, what you want to do, and maybe you need to consider having it there. If your pond water is not moving at all, if it starts to get stagnant, you might see streaks, like oil type streaks that are forming on the surface. Those types of things, are going to be indications that you want to do something. Consider putting that aeration in. So it's also an insurance policy. And so if you just want to have, make sure that your pond is extra safe, that you're not going to lose the fish, you put a lot of time and energy into managing your fish population, adding an aeration system it's beneficial all around. I mean, the only downside is the installation cost and the maintenance cost to having the aeration. So lots of benefits, getting it put in. Whether you can do that or not would be the reason to be hesitant about it.
Sure. So if we're going to aerate, should we aerate year round? Should we aerate at certain times of the year? What do you recommend there?
Yeah, one of the big things that I see is people, having good intentions, but not making the investment they need to. And so one of the things that is much worse than no aeration is having not enough aeration. And the reason for that is that you can have things happen, where the pond starts to stratify and then you have an influx and you mix it up and you have a turnover event. And so instead of having enough area where fish can thrive and an area where there's no oxygen, all of a sudden you have a really low amount of oxygen and you end up with a fish kill. And you see that both people trying to, get a smaller size system than they really need, or having fewer diffusers than they really need. That can happen. The other place it can happen is people trying to use windmills or solar. And windmills, if you think about aeration, the things we talked about, we really need that on days when the pond is still and it's warming up. We need to make sure we have aeration on those days. Those are the most dangerous days. And if there's a windmill, it's not going to be working on those days, and so your aeration is going to shut off. The other thing is that plants give off oxygen when they photosynthesize during the day, and when they transpire at night, they use up oxygen. And so when we need to have aeration most is throughout the night, and especially right before sunset. And a lot of the solar units, their batteries might not be capable of holding enough charge to run that compressor all the way through the night. And so you might end up with, very quickly the pond can stratify and you can end up with a really dangerous situation. So making sure that you have the right system, I think, is important there. And if you can't, then it's more recommended to just not aerate. I think you asked me, time of year or something, maybe if you need to aerate all the time. And aeration's really beneficial, especially in warmer months when the water starts to cool off. You get below 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit in that water temperature. Most of the activity in the pond, it doesn't stop, but it really slows down a lot to the point that you're not getting a lot of these benefits from the aeration system. We don't need to worry about stratification or oxygen levels. Colder water holds more oxygen too, so there's that aspect of it too. When it gets colder, I recommend turning them off. The other thing that can be a problem, and it doesn't happen that often, but it is a real risk, is if you're moving the water around enough, you can actually super chill the water. Where if you keep stirring something, you can cool it below freezing temperature, and so you can get it cool enough where the liquid water is actually hyper chilling, so it's getting really cold, and the fish that are swimming around will start to freeze from the inside out. It's not like they're going to turn into an ice cube or anything, but they're gonna have some damage and stress related to that colder water. So generally not recommended. Times when you might want to keep them on, if you're a big duck hunter, they might help keep the ice open if it's not super, super cold. And so there could be times that you want to use them, but generally you don't need them in those colder months.
Well, that makes sense for sure. So I've learned a lot in this episode, Joe. What are the, let's say, 3 or 4 main takeaways you want to make sure people bring away from this?
Yeah, I think aeration is something I get a lot of questions about, and people want to have surface fountains because they're prettier and they're generally cheaper, and so they kind of think they're hitting a home run when they do that. But it tends to be that benthic diffusion aeration systems are more beneficial. I think that's a really big key point. Keeping oxygen on the bottom layer and keeping your pond mixed up so that the bacteria that are on the benthos or the bottom of your pond can use up a lot of those nutrients is really important. And then I always say, just get out there and enjoy your pond. I think you'll start to see things that might be an indication that you need aeration, or maybe you can come up with other ways that you can get a lot of the same benefits without investing in an aeration system. So they're beneficial at times. Sometimes they're needed, sometimes they're not.
Well, that's great advice, Joe. Thanks for bringing this topic again, and thanks everybody for listening. We'll talk to you again in a couple weeks with a terrestrial topic.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.